Let's build a clock. Today on Let's Build, we're going to put together a simple clock using my favorite technologies: Next.js, React, TypeScript, Tailwind. We're going to build the project end to end. It's only going to take us a couple of minutes. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, this isn't a tutorial, so to speak. I'm not going to go through everything really in depth. So if you have questions about some things I gloss over, feel free to drop a comment and ask, and I'll get back to you. When starting off any project, my favorite thing to do is to really make sure we know where we're going, right? Let's take a moment and think about the end product. So if this is your browser window, I want this to be really simple. I want it to be the time, and it will, of course, be a clock, right? So it's going to update live. Now, this could be a starting place for a whole bunch of other projects. Maybe you want to just add this into something you're currently building. But we're just going to focus right now on building out the clock itself. And then, you can take it in whatever direction you want. So that's kind of what we're going for. So to start, we're going to do yarn create next app and fire this off. This is going to set all the defaults for us. We're using the new Next.js 13 app directory because server components are awesome. Also, solid technologies here like TypeScript and other good defaults. So we can now cd into clock, make sure we're in the right directory. We're going to fire up Visual Studio Code. And then while that launches, we're going to start the dev server. So this is going to launch, go over here, check out localhost port 3000, wait for it to go. It's always good to kind of just level set when you're starting a new project and make sure things are working before you go crazy. All right, perfect. We got Next.js 13. We have our code, and we can now kind of dive in. I'm just gonna get this to a good proper size. So we're using the app directory. Now, my favorite CSS framework is Tailwind. And even though we're not really using a lot of Tailwind in this project, I really like to just have it because it has a really good base for like a base CSS template, right? It normalizes everything you're gonna run across that might be different between browsers. And then, of course, just writing CSS is a joy with Tailwind as a framework. So luckily, I have a quick blog post for how you can configure it. So it just takes a second here to add it in. And we're going to do that. We'll allow you. And lastly, we'll make sure we add this to our globals. So jumping back here, we will delete everything and drop in Tailwind. All right, so we relaunch our dev server now. Once again, we've added Tailwind. Go back to Chrome, close that, and refresh. The page will look similar, but we'll have a few different styles here as the base Tailwind style has been applied. The next step, once this is going, is we're going to delete all of the sort of starter code that we have in here. Awesome. And we are going to build out what we want. So head, let's kind of give this a basic clock. And let's build a clock. Perfect. And layout. This is the layout file for the root layout of Next.js 13 apps. And since we're using Tailwind here, we don't really need this entire page. We can just delete all that CSS. And then we're also going to clear out all of this as well, because we don't really need it to start. All right. So if we refresh after cleaning up the entire project, it's a perfectly beautiful blank screen. It says clock up there. We know it's working. And now we can start getting into it. So the first thing I like to do is just kind of make sure we're moving the right direction. So we're just going to type in the time as it is right now and see that it is correctly loading. And then I want it in the middle of the screen, nice, large, and big, right? So we're gonna flex, we're gonna justify center, we're gonna make sure the items are center. And now you'll notice that it's in the middle of the screen, but when you inspect the element, the main div doesn't expand automatically to the full height of the screen, right? It only expands as high as its inner content needs it to. That's the base way browsers lay out their elements. And so what we want to do is we want to tell the main element, well, we actually want you to be the full size of the screen. You can do that with height to be 100% if all of the parent elements are also height 100%. But another easy way to do that is to just mark it to be height as the screen. And now we have our time in the middle. So we have our clock, but it's static. We want to have it automatically update to be the time. And when we're changing the value, that means we're adding state, right? So we need state to track it. And in Next.js 13, when you're doing anything with state, you're going to have to add this to a client component. So we're gonna do a new file. Let's call it clock. And we're gonna use the use client directive up here. And the one thing I'm gonna do actually is jump into a guest profile for this so we can make sure there's no extensions or anything that have loaded, right? So now when we inspect, we're just getting pure, clean. It's gonna yell at me for the React Dev Tools, but that's fine. For this client component, right, I always like to start when you're refactoring things by just moving around what you currently have. So don't go crazy and add a whole bunch of stuff. And we're going to export the clock, and then here we can simply import it. And this server component, all components in this directory are server by default, will now use this client component and will re-render. So if we refresh, all right, it still says 11:48 because, well, we aren't using real time yet. So let's go ahead and change that and make this use actual time. So time set time equals use state, and we'll just set it to a new date. And then for a very basic clock here, whoops, we can do time dot local time string, a very nice method that basically formats it to use the local time, and it'll use the browser local by default. And there we go. It added in the seconds for us. That's part of the standard way it displays the time. And it correctly updated, to the time that we have up here. So that's awesome, but it's not updating, right? We want it to be a clock. So in order to get it to update, we need to have it sort of refresh at a cadence. Now that to me says we're going to refresh on a timer. So we should use set interval to kind of schedule this to go out. So if we just do set interval here, right? The problem with that, it'll work poorly. The set time, new date, every second. The problem is this will execute every time the component renders. So every time this component renders and the execution goes through it, it's going to start a new timer. So we're going to end up having lots and lots and lots of timers, right? So if you do like console.log time and do new date get time, right? And then look at it. Oh my God. Like we only want it to update once a second. But because we have so many timers going, it's updating way, way, way more often than that. So in order to fix that, right, you want to say only create this timer and start updating. Only do that the first time the component renders. And so that is the use effect hook. So this will only execute when we put in an empty dependency array the first time the component goes. So now, if we clear the console and refresh, now every second we get what we expect. The reason it happens twice is because we're in React strict mode, so things will render twice. That's fine. All right. Because we're using useEffect, we need to return a function for clear interval, and let's call it timer, and then we'll display const, we'll do that. So when the component unmounts, we can clean up the timer that we created. We don't need that anymore. Save, go back here, hard refresh, and now we have our clock that is updating and we're good to go. So that is how you can create a clock in React and Next.js and have it kind of update live on the site. But we can do a little bit better here. There's some refinement that we can do to make this work. First of all, we want it to be bigger. That's always a nice thing. So let's do class text 7XL. This is just making it larger. Perfect. And then we have this error which is being thrown. Okay, it's a warning, fine, whatever. But what Next.js is saying is that when Next rendered this on the server, it got this exact string. But then when it rendered it on the client, it got 55 seconds instead of 54 seconds. So the difference in rendering times actually caused this to be different. And what's happening is when this is rendered on the server, this is one particular moment in time. And then when it renders again on the client and it hydrates, time has passed. And so it's picking up sometimes a new second. And in general, this isn't going to cause a lot of problems, but it's nice to be able to get rid of errors like this, right? We want it to be as clean as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the original time that is first rendered on the server. So we can do type props time. We're going to do a number, so we'll just do the Unicode number instead of like a string for UTC time. And then we're going to name it initial. If I could type initial props, and then here we'll pass it in to the constructor, right? So this is saying the date, oh, well, it doesn't show me the constructor for new date. Well, we're going to use the initial time to properly hydrate this date to be the original thing. Now, of course, on our home component, we now need to pass this due to the clock. So const, let's just do now equals new date. The home component here renders on the server. And so we're taking it and we're going to pass it time equals now get time to the client. And this is the client component. And so in Chrome, clear everything out, big refresh. Now we have no more error. You can refresh as much as you want, but the client is always going to start with the initial value that the server had. So you're not going to have that mismatch between server component and what's rendered on the server and the client component, what's rendered on the client. Now we can still do a little bit better here. One of the small things that bothers me is the string moves, right? Every time the number changes, there's slightly different widths. Now, there's a fun little property in Tailwind that actually helps us. I mean, it's not a property in Tailwind, it's a CSS property, but I found it stumbling upon Tailwind. In the typography stuff, there's fun font things you can do with fonts that support them. Not all fonts support all these things, so keep that in mind, right? But these are the various different stuff that you can kind of do to numbers. You can have /0s, you can do old style figures, numbers can be proportional, but we actually want tabular numbers, right, that have a uniform width. So when this changes, we don't want the width to actually change. And so we can accomplish that in our clock component by adding in this Tailwind class, or use the CSS underneath it. And now in Chrome, it's beautiful. Like, it is pristine. So now you've completely built a clock in React and Next.js. One more thing that I think we can do to refine it, to make things just a little nicer, is the local time string actually takes a couple of arguments, and there's some options here. And the options allow you to specify how you want to format parts of the string. And so what we can do is, to make it a little more clock-like, is we can say we want the hours. This is the second argument. So the first one is the locale, and we can just pass undefined for the default locale. And then, so now we can do hour, 2-digit, minute, 2-digit. And now perfectly, you have the time kind of as you expect with fixed width numbers, and it's a clock without the seconds. And you can add in seconds if you want, but this is kind of exactly what we had designed in the beginning. So now you've successfully built a clock using Next.js, React, and it's pretty gosh darn good, if I do say so myself. Okay, but if we wanted to gold plate the shit out of this, I think what we really need to add is a digital clock font, right? Something that screams digital clock. Now, there's a couple of ways we can go about doing this. You can go look through Google Fonts, right, which is like the place to get fonts, and try and find one that looks close-ish. I've done a little bit of research, and there are a couple that are like, close, but nothing that really is exactly what we're looking for. So I just start looking on the internet, right? So we want digital font. All right, bunch of free digital fonts. Like, this is kind of what we're looking for. In fact, this top one looks awesome. So go ahead and download it and show in Finder. Here we go. Let's close out of that. Ridden with ads. Unzip this. See what we got. Digital 7. Okay. So we got some italic, mono. Yeah, this looks pretty good. Let's grab the mono one, right? You can just preview it. And we're going to toss this right into Visual Studio Code. So because we're using the app directory, we can just make folders, and they won't turn into pages because you need the page specific file in it. So let's rename this to, let's just do digital. And now we have a digital font in our fonts directory, and we need to load it. And Next.js recently has added a fonts package, which is a really great way to be able to load font either from Google or locally. Since we downloaded something, we're gonna do local. So let's see, I want local font, optimizing font. Here we go. Local fonts, optimizing fonts. So this was installed by default with that next command line that we did. We're gonna fire this off. We're gonna load it here. And names. So let's call it digital local font source. This is a relative path. So it's in fonts and we named it digital and it was a TTF file, right? So now go back to our project, refresh, make sure everything's good. Okay. So how do we do this? Let's see, we take my font and we add it as a class name is how we do it. So to do that, we're gonna fire this. And then add it as digital.classname, save and refresh. All right, didn't work at all. So what exactly is going on? Fonts digital TTF, fonts digital TTF. Looks like that should work. We're loading local font digital. Fonts, did I spell it correctly? Yes, class name, perfect. Add it right there. Make sure we saved. Refresh. Guess we didn't save. And now we have a sweet digital font to go with our clock. And that basically sums up everything you have to do in order to make a digital clock using these technologies. So we started a brand new project. We ran through, we added a client component, which used the state to make sure it updated the time correctly. We made sure the server and the client had no mismatch, so there was no warnings. So we're hydrating everything properly. And then, for fun, we added a sweet font to create this awesome digital clock. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you perhaps learned something. It's kind of fun to build these things end to end. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and go ahead and subscribe. I'm going to be sharing the code so you can take a look at this. And until next time, happy coding.